pain in the butt when you have to wear other glasses.
Especially for my first time ever, I did not pass my driver's test without a pair of glasses on.
Oh wow! You actually have to take an eye exam.
I've got an astigmatism, and it was been kind of slight, and I can still get squeezed through the exam.
Yeah.
But the last time I looked at it, I'm like, that's a mess.
Thank you. How are you?
No.
Good.
As long as you can pass it with the glasses.
I could.
Yeah.
Although I might need a new prescription at this point. I
Does
haven't
it
really
mean
been wearing them much
are you
for a long
driving
time.
with your glasses though? Is the question.
You know, I can see everything without them.
How many horses do you have there?
I think we've got 13 there right now.
I'm far from like.
Average?
I can only do 15.
Compared in any
I
serious
built
way.
it off.
Okay.
I built it with 15 because
Yeah.
I knew if I had to
I'm
take
still kind of borderline. I'm just on the other edge of borderline now.
So there's a couple, we've got a few stalls open. But
They have no
we've got 13.
endorsement for
Yeah,
And
it's,
their owners are pretty active. They come and ride a lot. Or I see people up and down the road
Yeah.
every once in a while.
yeah, there's 3 of them there that belong to
The
New
camera's
Hampshire.
not rolling yet, is it?
Oh, is that
So
right?
of course
Okay.
they're gone.
Get me on record saying
I'm used to reading with glasses on.
Oh, yeah.
You look at a computer screen, it's like, oh god, no.
It works. Amanda really likes doing
The hard part, like
Yeah. Is that your daughter?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, she's my oldest daughter. She's one.
that hurts.
And
Got any races
for the
planned
most
for this
part,
winter
yes,
yet?
and I will tell you most of them
Well,
are
yeah, we have.
people there.
I actually had 4 events in a row down in
And they're
Charlton,
great.
Mass.
Yeah.
It's at a site that's got
They're easy to deal with. They do their
really
own thing,
coarse
and,
gravel, so like it holds up really well when it's wet or snowy.
Right.
you know, it's
Tires.
It's not cheap, right?
It's just really
Right.
hard.
Horses. No. That's what
Sandpaper.
everyone's- I've never owned one, but that's what everyone says.
expensive.
Yeah.
Are we?
Either love it or
Are you?
happy medium. That's
Might be able to get back into your place sometime next summer. Maybe.
Oh, maybe next summer.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Winter's tough on that hill.
Yeah, yeah. I can understand that.
You guys wouldn't get back out.
I've
I guess we'll get going without Neil.
Unfortunately, for me, December is like the busiest time of the year. One week I was in New York, and the next week I was in Boston for work. So
All right.
but I watched and read. So
Good evening, everyone.
is I can.
It is 6:31, and I'm going to call the January 5th, 2023 Planning Board meeting to order. And I'll begin by reading the roll. Rebecca?
I'm here.
Phil?
Here.
Neil is absent. Mike?
Here.
Mark?
Here.
And Susan.
Here.
Alternates, Zach Terrell of the Select Board, Michael Bouchard, and Peter Julia.
Here.
Okay. Actually, a question about, well, we're not going to be voting on anything, probably. Actually, we always could.
We need to vote to adjourn.
Yeah. If the
Only a select board
Select Board
representative
member
can
is
be
not here, then we do not seat anyone. Okay. That's what I was checking, yeah.
here, Unfortunately. That's why we have a select board alternative.
Exactly.
We
all
only
right.
have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
He's the 7th.
Neil
Neil
the
is the 7th.
Neil. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Of course. Jeez.
I just wanted to double check before moving on. All right, so up next we have the review of minutes from our December 15th meeting. Hopefully you all have a copy. I want to reiterate, thank you, Joseph. These are with a complex discussion, and these are quite thorough. Took a while to get through. Any comments?
I just have one thing, under the other, where I made the statement about that process that we were doing. It wasn't regarding the amendment that I was having a problem with, it was the process.
other business.
Pardon me?
It was under other business.
Yeah, I was under other, yep.
Yeah, page 4. Any other comments?
Move to approve the minutes with the edit as noted by Sue.
Second?
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes with that one edit. All in favor? Aye. Oh, I didn't ask if any further discussion, but I assume not. Okay. Opposed? Abstentions?
Abstaining.
Okay, the minutes are approved. So, do we have any public comments not related to the business on the agenda tonight? So nothing about the zoning amendments, but any other public comments? Yes,
I'm
Frank?
here to talk about the content of the discussion tonight. I am in here to complain about the profile and the manner in which you print this out in microprint that the average citizen cannot read nor even understand. Plus, any recommended changes you would have should be highlighted on a single page, 12-point print that a person with reasonable vision could acquire any kind of words or knowledge. Thank you.
One page with the changes. Would you like it?
Yes.
Here you go. There are extras here, if anybody would like one.
And that is a
Sorry.
narrative of, and just to be clear, that's a narrative of the changes, not the actual wording changes, correct?
Is it?
It needs to be incorporated in the page of the ordinance that you're trying to change.
This will at least get you to the.
It gives you the page
article
numbers.
being changed.
That one gives you the page numbers and a narrative description of what's being changed.
And if the pile at the front of the room has run out, we can certainly provide more copies of that. If anyone didn't get one who would like one of the other version.
All right, thank you, Frank.
Is this a narrative, or this is the language, is it not?
It's the narrative.
It's a narrative.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I think what it's not gonna cover are the ones that we're changing to, be legal and for the floodplain development and things like that, where the language is a bit more extensive and there's a lot more changes.
Right. Okay.
All right. Okay. Have there been communications received by the board?
We did receive actually a communication, an amendment to a wetlands permit regarding the Riverside Landing 2 application that was, this board approved for a creation of development pad out there at that site. There was, let me just take a look back here. The revisions include some changes to wetlands impacts, including some culverts and site design, potential site design changes, including some depicted commercial development. Of course, this is just, a wetlands permit application, but we did receive a request for a conceptual consultation for the next meeting
Okay.
from Mr. McGinley.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Did that wetlands permit amendment, has that gone to DES and has it been approved yet, or is that in process?
There's an application, we were copied on the application, and my understanding anyway is that it has not been approved.
Okay, thanks.
So that'll be at our January 19th meeting?
That's correct. Oh, and we also received another request for a conceptual for the 19th
Okay.
from Tenny Mountain Development Group, Michael Bouchard.
Okay. All right. Up next, we have reports of committees. The Hop Grant Housing Committee in particular. Actually, does anybody else before we go there have any other committee updates? No? Okay. I'll say for the Hop Grant Committee, we had a little bit of a break for the holidays. We have our next meeting coming up this coming week on Tuesday morning at 9.
John,
what's-
can you explain what the HOP grant is for the members?
I'm
of the
sorry,
public?
yeah. We've been doing this for several weeks now, and I should step back, actually, since there are probably several people in this room unfamiliar. So the town of Plymouth received a grant for $134,000, I think is the number, right? 134?
That's correct.
To do a housing study and analysis of our zoning and regulations, and possibly make suggestions for changes depending on how the analysis goes. As that's a 3-stage process, and so we're just in the early stages of that now, working out a agreement with our consultant to carry us through that process, which will take us through about another year and a half to get that completed. Yeah, so it's a housing study that we're doing. The Housing Opportunity Planning Grant, that was for HOP grant, where that comes from. And thank you for reminding me, Phil, to
Sorry.
step back for a moment to explain. And yeah, so we are moving forward. We have the agreement between the town and Invest New Hampshire signed. I believe we're at the final stages, right, of the agreement, Joseph, with our planning consultant to get that squared away. And currently, for our next meeting, we're pulling together our own sense of priorities and a mission statement that's growing out of our initial grant application to kind of guide the process forward and kind of have a nice, concise public statement about what we're doing. Anybody else have anything to add to that? Sue, Mike, no? Okay.
You announced the consultant once they're
Yeah, I mean,
signed.
we're not quite there yet, right?
Yeah, I think it's,
I mean, it's all public knowledge anyway.
Right.
The
I
meetings
think it's
are
fine.
public.
yeah, I think it's fine if you want to.
It's Barrett Planning. And we had some really great, as we talked about in previous meetings, some really great consultants that we talked to, and kind of a hard choice between a couple of them in the end, but we ultimately chose Barrett Planning, and they seemed like they were going to be really good and helping us get it through this process.
Are we allowed to set the agenda as to what exactly they look at in the zoning ordinance, or is it an overall thing, or how does that work?
Well, they're gonna start by taking, I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach, but it's partially doing demographic studies and partially looking at our housing stock, and then combining that also with public outreach to kind of gauge public input into the process. And as that starts to get compiled together in the first phase, then we kind of move into the second phase where they start to analyze our regulations and zoning ordinance and see how that matches up with our needs and our current stock and all that. And from there, go forward to see if there's any recommendations they can make.
Great.
All right. So up next on new business is the first of our two public hearings. The second one will be 2 weeks from tonight, on the 19th, for our 2023 proposed zoning amendments. And I took a couple of notes to myself here. Probably many of you have seen already in the room, but there is a summary description of the zoning amendments available online as well as at Town Hall, and also in the notification that was sent out to the newspaper. And a more full description as well of or a fuller document can be found with these changes at Town Hall or at PlymouthNewHampshire.org. One thing I actually was noticing, Joseph, if you can address this perhaps, I was on the, maybe we might not be able to, I was on the PlymouthNewHampshire.org website, and I was looking for the date, which is usually in early March, when this will actually come up for the vote, and I did not see it on the calendar.
I apologize, I actually do not have that date offhand, but I can certainly get that,
Okay.
get that information.
So I'll just step back a little and describe the process. These are amendments to our zoning ordinance. So these are the laws that we have in place to guide land use in the town, telling us what uses and forms and setbacks and so forth are available in various zones of the town. And this is a document ideally that's guided by input we get in every 10 years or so in doing the master plan, as well as lots of other input along the way, and ultimately feed into other land use regulations in town as well. But this is the document that really defines what is and is not permissible in terms of land use in the town of Plymouth. And so as far as the timeline goes, so we have two public hearings tonight and 2 weeks from tonight. And according to, I was just reading this document here on the calendar from the state, the last day to hold a final public hearing on proposed zoning amendments is January 30th, although there's an asterisk in small print that said it is strongly recommended that public hearings be done by then. So it's a kind of a soft deadline, I suppose. However, there's a deadline on the 7th of February to get in place the official copies of the proposed amendments. So it is a pretty quick timeline after January. And then ultimately, these will come to a vote in early March, usually, and we'll get the exact date, I suppose, soon. And let's see. Yeah, so a little bit of background on some of these, how we kind of came to these. There are multiple ways that we come to look at what might be changed, looking for inconsistencies in our zoning ordinance, getting public feedback, looking at our master plan, feedback from staff as they talk to various individuals in town. And this summer in particular, we also had a couple of walking tours downtown that the planning board led, in which a few members of the public as well as the board looked at what we had, what was really working well, what sorts of things were in and out of conformity with our zoning, and what kind of visions we might have. And there were some interesting discussions, which have also informed, I think, some of what we have here this evening. So what I'd like to do is go through the amendments one at a time, a total of 7, and this way we can focus our discussions during our public hearing on one of these at a time and kind of keep ourselves focused. If you'd like to speak, come up to the podium, identify yourself, and try to keep it within 3 or 4 minutes, your comments. Be as specific as possible. If we have time, we can always kind of go back for another round if necessary, if you'll have more to say. And I want to think, on our part, I think ideally we hold off on having any strong reactions to our public input until our next meeting, after everyone gets to be heard, rather than responding kind of halfway through the process. So we'll be doing a lot of listening tonight, and probably not all that much responding yet. You could ask us questions, of course, but I think it's probably best practice to save our stronger responses about how we go forward until we hear everyone after our second meeting.
John, can I just ask a
yeah.
question for clarification? Are we going to go through each amendment one at a time? You'll open the public hearing, people can make comments on each amendment one at a time, or?
So I think that my thought going into this was to open the public hearing and then give a short introduction to an amendment, get public feedback on it, go to the next one, get public feedback.
All right, I just want to make sure.
As opposed to having a kind of long, sprawling conversation about everything.
So if someone has a latent thought about the first topic, when we're on the 6th, we can come back to it.
We probably can, yeah. I think we can be flexible, but this is the ideal scenario at least.
I agree. I think that's a good.
Yeah.
If I can interject, the town elections will be March 14th.
March 14th. Thank you.
It's on the town clerk's website. Wi-Fi?
Oh, the guest account. That is.
Do you know?
Oh, I used to know actually. I might actually. Let me see if I have it written down somewhere.
Who needs it?
Steve Rand in the back.
Can't pick up the Rand's hardware one from here? No, I can't. Really weak.
So you've got it? Okay. Oh, I just found it. Plymouth 2020. Yeah, I have it. Yeah. Okay, so our first amendment. Actually, I'll open the public hearing. So it is 6:48, and I will open the public hearing for our zoning amendments. Again, I'll give a quick, hopefully a quick introduction to each of these, and then open up for discussion. So our first amendment is Article 3, Section 304, about area dimensions. And just to read a quick synopsis, reducing front setbacks in the single-family residential, multifamily residential, and village commercial zones, as well as establishing a maximum setback in the village commercial zone. So as far as the village commercial, some of this came from our walking tour and looking at what was working, what wasn't working, some of the safety issues with parking in front of buildings and really long curb cuts. So thinking about that, but also thinking about if we look at the whole of the village commercial, which is the downtown area, for our current ordinance, which has 15-foot setbacks, most of the kind of most vibrant section of our downtown near the common, right outside of this building, does not follow that. So most of our downtown, we call our downtown here, is actually out of conformity with that. And then you have other parts where we are discussing, like, would it be better or not to reduce some of that setback, to perhaps think about the character going forward, as well as these safety issues with parking in front of buildings, with these very busy sidewalks. And so this is some of our thinking, and we can talk more about that as we go forward. But thinking about what a walkable downtown is, and even if, like, God forbid, one of our buildings came down in downtown, in the kind of core of downtown, like, if you follow our current ordinance for rebuilding, it actually would look very different than what we have. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of issues to think about there. And then, in addition to that, there's also the residential areas, single-family and multifamily residential, where also a lot of our housing stock currently is not in conformity with the 30-foot setback that is currently in the ordinance. So if you're staying near the downtown area and all the housing over there, there's a lot of setbacks from the street that are much less than 30 feet. And so it would allow some of those to come back into conformity with our zoning ordinance, and we would allow a 15-foot, if these changes go through, a 15-foot setback by special exception. So it wouldn't just be default, but you can go to the zoning board and request a 15-foot setback. And if it seemed in character with the neighborhood, which it is or isn't depending on where you are, that would be allowed.
John, can I just say
Yeah.
a quick word? So, the public may note that what we're proposing is to reduce the setback to 15 feet by special exception. So a special exception does require that the applicant go to the ZBA,
Zoning board.
the zoning board, but it's not as rigorous a test as a variance. So without the allowance for a special exception, when you go to the zoning board of adjustment, you have to file for a variance. And one of the criteria, I think, is that you have to demonstrate hardship, I think, and that's not necessarily required if it's allowed by special exception. So it's a lower standard, it's easier to meet, it's meant to be, if you can meet the special exception criteria, you can apply for you can be granted special exception. It's much easier than the variance. So it still does require noticing and visiting the ZBA, but it's an easier standard. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Peter, since you're a member of the ZBA.
You got it.
Okay, thank you. But I just wanted to introduce
No,
that.
that's a good clarification.
It's kind of a slightly complicated topic that
Yeah.
not everybody may have been through. So.
Oh, and actually, I should also mention, within the in the summary, along with, so thinking about the village commercial and our current 15-foot setback, so we would be reducing it to a 0 minimum, which much of downtown is, with a 10-foot maximum, kind of seeing any new development kind of mirroring what we have in the kind of core part of downtown here. And reducing the ability of anybody to put parking in front of their building, which makes it a difficult situation for pedestrians, bikes, and even cars on Main as people try to pull out of those spots. So I think with that, we can probably open it up. Are there any comments about this particular amendment? Okay. So with that, we will move to the second amendment, which is, if you're looking at the full ordinance, Article 4, Section 402, measuring maximum height. To read the summary, allowing the maximum height of 35 feet to be measured from Main Street rather than average grade around the building. So currently, the maximum height to build in Plymouth is 35 feet. And so we're not proposing to change that. However, looking at the circumstances, especially on Main, where we do have some taller buildings, there's a pretty steep slope there. And currently we measure height by the average grade of the building. So if you're building on a slope and you're measuring height by the average, what you actually get on the frontage on Main is a pretty small, like one-story building basically, if you're gonna follow the ordinance. And so what we're saying here is, considering that if you have frontage on Main Street, that we can measure 35 feet off of Main instead. And again, that brings a lot of what we already have on Main Street into conformity, and also gives a bit more flexibility for building off of Main Street without changing our 35-foot guideline that we have in place. Any feedback from the public? Yes?
So by the way, the Wi-Fi doesn't work. I'm Steve Rand. I wonder if you have considered the question of height, the gross question of height as well as this fine tuning of it, of the definition of it, because if I understand, 35 feet is enough for 2 stories, but it's not enough for 3 stories. And frankly, I never understood why we were interested in the height of buildings, particularly in the commercial and the multifamily residential zone, because all the issues having to do with parking, having to do with stairs and life safety and all that would all be taken care of by life safety codes and other things that we already have implemented in there. So it seems like if someone wanted to get creative and build a high-rise building in our town to accommodate more people, which seems to be a need, then we are unnecessarily preventing them from even considering it. I'd say unnecessarily, yes, because it's not permitted, right, to go above 35 feet. And so I would just like to sort of put that oar back in the water, because you don't know what's been prevented from happening because we had that. And we will never know what is possible unless we open it up. So the 35 feet is, and then of course what you're doing, and I don't see anybody probably complaining about it, is that if you're on the west side of Main Street, you're getting dinged because you no longer have the same height possibility as you did before. Mm-hmm. I'm not on the west side, so I don't really care.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
Might I suggest that the first issue he raised be a good question for the HOP grant investigation?
No, yeah, I was actually going to address some of this by mentioning the HOP grant. So it's thinking about housing people in this town. This is what the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant that we're working on right now is supposed to address, including potentially making regulatory recommendations for us. And that could be a recommendation. And at this point, we're still early in the process. And I think we kind of on this side of the table are placing our faith in this process of public engagement and research to hopefully give us some good guidance going forward. And rather than kind of chewing too far into that before this process is done, it might be kind of good to let that process kind of run its course. And I would also just say, I think this is a good step in a positive direction for allowing some flexibility in development on Main. And it's sometimes beneficial to take a kind of incremental approach and see how things go after a change. And I mean, we're not going to have 20 developers developing in 1 year anyway on Main Street, and like all of a sudden it changes overnight. But let's kind of take an incremental approach and see how things go, and then see what the HOP grant says about what recommendations come out of that process. And but yeah, thoughts duly noted. Thank you, Steve. Any other comments? Okay. The third amendment we have up is Article 4, Section 409, accessory use chickens. And just to, again, to read the summary, establishing criteria for allowing chickens to be kept in a single-family residential zone. So currently, in the single-family residential zone, chickens are not allowed to be kept by our zoning ordinance. And there are people with chickens, and we've probably seen them. And it's not currently a use in the single-family residential. So this would establish that use in single-family residential, and also give us the teeth to be able to regulate that use now that we've established it, by assuming this would pass, by, for example, limiting the number of chickens to 10, I believe it is, we decided upon, as well as limiting the sex of the chickens, no roosters, which is often what the complaints come from when it comes to chickens, and also some parameters around waste and such issues, having, you know, agricultural animals on your property in a residential zone. So that's the gist of that amendment. And if anybody wants, we can read the specific language, but that's the kind of general gist. Is there any feedback about chickens and single-family residential? Yes.
Nick Mason. You might also consider some sort of language. The thing, I feel like 10 years ago there were a lot of downtown chickens, and there still are some, but maybe not as many, because I think many families who went through it wound up having like a bloodbath situation when we have a dry year and bears enter the town, or weasels or whatever. So I think you might also have some language about how it would be regulated when there is a nuisance bear or something like that, as well as the odor and the numbers and stuff.
Thank you.
But it's good. I like seeing anything. I like seeing things that are rules that are not enforced being brought into like a more reasonable. I do agree that it's probably fun.
Thank you.
Making it allowed instead of just looking the other way.
Yeah. And then once it's allowed, you can actually regulate it. All right. So Article 7, this is our fourth amendment, floodplain development. Read the summary here. Amendments necessary to comply with the National Flood Insurance Program. And so these aren't necessarily amendments that we came up with because we really were dying to change this section of our zoning ordinance, but rather if we want to remain in compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, we were advised to make these changes. And so you can look at what the changes are, and
Mostly definitions.
yeah.
It was, I mean, most of it came up through was that through the DES that did the audit of it?
Yeah, and it's it's the language is it's pretty lengthy in places, but yeah. So
If
there's
this,
not too much option there really if we want to
No.
stay part of that.
and if we want to allow property owners in to be able to purchase flood insurance.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Are there any comments? Yes, Frank.
I don't have any comment about the new proposed, but I would like to point out the fact that our existing ordinance under definitions, it says under basement, see flood zone development. If you see this flood zone development, it says these terms shall only be used in the flood zone, okay?
Okay.
Which means we don't have a definition of basement if you're not in the flood zone. So we might put in a definition of basement that you can use if you're not in a flood zone.
That's a great suggestion.
Thank
Thank you.
Okay. Our fifth amendment is Article 12, Section 1204.3D, special exception criteria for off-site parking. Amending the criteria for special exception for off-site parking facilities to state that they shall be reasonably and safely accessible from the use the parking facility serves. So currently in the ordinance, it's written that off-site parking must be within 300 feet. And so we're changing the 300 feet to say reasonably and safely accessible, and to give a bit more flexibility than the rigid number of 300 feet, to prioritize things like context and circumstances and the judgment of the zoning board to make the right decision in this situation, rather than sticking to the 300 feet as a hard number. Are there any thoughts or comments about that change, or potential change? Yes?
May I ask why you want to change that 300 feet? What's the reason?
This is something that was recommended coming from staff, and they were, there's a lot of things that can come up in looking at our zoning amendments and talking to potential, and I know there was an issue that just came before the ZBA like 2 days ago, right, with this issue, about, one of these issues that came up was the question of off-site parking and the 300-foot barrier, and if there was any flexibility there to get a special exception or what have you. In this case, it would have had to be a variance to go over 300 feet. And so the question was raised, what serves, not this particular case, but in general, what serves the town better, to have a numerical guideline there or a guideline more based in the judgment of the zoning board? And so it's a change from a number to a judgment about what's safe and reasonable.
And how many years that 300 feet has been in place?
I didn't track the changes backward.
Why change it? It worked. Why you're going to change it? Because someone wanna build something and put more people in Main Street, and then we're suffering, parking, people going around the common and leave to Lincoln or someone else. I don't think it's a good idea at all.
Okay.
I suppose in my case is try to solve the parking issue first.
I don't think there's anybody up here. Yeah.
More cars in parking.
Yeah.
Reduce the parking spot 1 inch and you get 40 more parkings in 1 inch, 1 foot. Yes, the school have 2 huge parking lots. They allow us to use 2 weeks in the year. And they are off the school from December 15 to January 30th. They do whatever they want. And I learned the other day that 53% of the property here in town is non-profit and they don't pay taxes. And that bothers me big time, because only 1,400 people are paying for a city, for a town much, much bigger.
I would just mention one point of clarification. Some, not all of those nonprofits do pay payments in lieu of taxes. And we can argue about if it's enough or not, but yeah.
Can I offer a narrative to demonstrate
Sure.
two examples here? So, in discussing this, there were two things that came up. One would be if you had a site that was 305 feet away from, let's say, Steve Rand wanted to provide off-site parking for his business, and it was 305 feet away, that would require variance. The other situation is, currently as it stands, if, let's say, a business on Tenny Mountain Highway didn't have adequate parking where they were, but they owned the parcel across the road, it would be less than 300 feet, but there'd be no safety requirement there. So this proposed language does require that it be both safely accessible, even if it's less than 300 feet. So that is a change, which makes sense. And that, if it's further than 300 feet, as long as it could be 300 feet of sidewalk along Main Street. That, there's nothing that would be, in my mind, that would be a fairly reasonable thing to expect. But
Mike?
go ahead.
Partially right, but you're gonna, any type of off-site parking, as I understand it, needs a special exception. So if it's gonna be across the street, they're still gonna need the special exception, like they would need with the proposed change, still a special exception. It's just where it was limiting it to 300 feet, the proposed change would make it unlimited. And even if it's 305 feet, you could still go for a variance.
Okay.
Let's clarify, when we say unlimited, I mean, it's still the judgment of the zoning board to make a reasonable decision, which we hope they would.
Richard Gowan. I agree with making this change. I think 300 feet is too short of a distance. If you were placed in the middle of downtown and you need to do this, where are you gonna find property within 300 feet of that business or apartment or whatever? I understand that there are people talking about the fact that they wanna not allow more apartments in downtown. I'm not sure that I see what apartments are there are causing any trouble to downtown, and a few more I don't think would cause much trouble either, okay? In order to accommodate anything like that, you're gonna be over 300 feet away to get some parking. I think the zoning board has the ability to use their judgment and make decisions. If it's 1,500 feet away, that's an average of a 10-minute walk for people, okay? That's not that big of a deal to walk to that parking lot from your apartment 1,500 feet away. 300 feet away, in my opinion, is really ridiculous. It's too short. It doesn't work. And once again, it's gonna be the zoning board who's gonna make the decision, does this make sense? And it's gonna be through the special exception and looking at it. And I think that they're gonna do a fine job with it. I don't see the 300 feet being something that's necessary. I think we can trust in our people on the zoning board to deal with it.
Thank you.
Steve, I hope you don't mind that I used you as an example.
Although as a business and the village commercial.
Lets me talk more. So, Steve Rand, and I would like some clarification, because it seems to me as though the talk about downtown really isn't anything, because there is, if I'm not mistaken, there is no parking requirement for any building in the village commercial zone.
For a business, which is why I mentioned that you had a business.
Right.
For residential, there is.
There is?
Residential in the village commercial zone?
I
I
thought
don't
residential-
believe so.
No?
In all areas except the village commercial zone, off-street parking spaces shall be provided in accordance with the following schedule.
I'm gonna get lost in the zoning ordinance now.
So am I correct that there is no requirement for parking
Correct.
in the village commercial zone? Okay, so that doesn't pertain to you, doesn't pertain to me, doesn't pertain to Chuck, it only pertains to the other zones. And it only pertains, correct me when I'm wrong here, it only pertains when there's a desire for that person to meet the requirement for parking, and possibly the site isn't large enough to do what is necessary to meet the requirements. And then that property owner would look for and hopefully obtain an off-site lot so that if he gets a positive special exception, he can actually build out to a more maximum condition than he would have otherwise. And so, am I on the right track with this? I mean, that's the net effect of this thing, right? So, so then the question is whether or not, the 300 feet. So the other question that I have, and that now all makes kind of good sense to me, but the other question I have is what is the practical requirement for this off-site parking? Does that have to be owned property? And does it have to be deeded? And if it's not owned and deeded, then how does the town, so there has to be some kind of perpetual lease? And how is that, how is that?
That's currently defined and it's not proposed to be changed. The language says the proposed off-site parking facility must be located on land owned by, leased to, or legally reserved for the owner of the use for which the parking facility is provided. That's what's currently written and nothing's proposed to change about that.
Right. So that seems like a giant hole, because if you get that permission by leasing some property, it would seem like from your next door neighbor, and you propose to park all the people that you're now permitted to have on that lot there, then as soon as that lease goes away or terminates, now the town has the problem again, and it's, I'm not so sure that I'm all that concerned about it, but maybe we should be. And it's not the germane question even with respect to what we're talking about. So the question is, should it be 300 feet or could it be more? I think more is fine. It does seem as though that there's a lot of wiggle room in the question about what are the terms exactly, whether or not it's shall be reasonably and safely accessible.
Mm-hmm. And those are criteria that the ZBA would consider in their
Right.
special exception.
So there's no definition of those things, of course, so that's just a matter of how they decide, right?
So there is no even though there's no requirement for parking on Main Street, there is a requirement that an off-site parking facility be permitted. So someone from Main Street, whether it be an apartment or a business, could apply. Let's say they bought a vacant lot on Merrill Street and wanted to provide parking for either residents or a business. That site would have to have a permit for off-site parking. And it would be related to a primary use. Right now, that use has to be within 300 feet of the off-site parking. This would allow an exception, the special exception would allow that to be any distance as long as it's safely accessible.
Where is the off-site parking in the,
It's page 66.
is it the same?
Yeah. That's what's currently in our zoning ordinance. And all I'm saying is right now, it doesn't allow you to have an off-site parking facility that's greater than 300 feet from the primary use.
So this would in fact allow that, so that's a positive to any Main Street person who wants
Or
to
business
have an
or
off-site
residence.
parking facility. And,
One thing I want to just I don't know, but I read in the paper, wasn't there just a zoning board thing about this exact thing for an existing property?
On Tuesday, yes.
Did they pass that? Was
No.
it a variance or an exception?
It was a variance, and you can speak, but it did not pass, right?
Okay, okay.
This is not related to any specific case. This was
Right, no,
This was recommended as a result of that application, but
I was just looking for it for context for how hard it is to get that variance or exception versus changing the language, just because I'm sure you're all reasonable and concerned with safety, but you're probably not lifetime members of the planning board, and so
Well,
all
generally
you got to do is look at our national politics. We don't know who comes after you.
so generally speaking, as
So I think it might be good to have some sort of actual parameter and not just
I say, generally speaking,
vague
as Phil
language.
was saying earlier, the bar for a variance is pretty high.
Right,
And you have to prove a lot.
Right.
Whereas for a special exception, it's a process you go through, and you can still get rejected, of course.
Sure.
But there are guidelines, and if you, it's
I just want,
easier
like,
bar.
for some context, because that's one where they're already the existing owners of the
Yeah.
properties in question.
And
And
the adjudicative board that makes those decisions about that imprecise language is actually not the planning board, it's the zoning board.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Still,
And-
it still applies to them as well.
For good reason.
Right, right. So, you know, we can propose changes, they have to be voted on by town meeting, but they're actually, you know, the special exception are evaluated by the zoning board, so there are multiple parties happening already.
Yes. Oh, I think Frank's going to go first then.
Frank Miller. I did the parking inventory in 2000, and I re-accomplished it in 2020. The Village Commercial Zone starts at Merrill Street, ends at Warren Street in the south. There are exactly 505 spaces in the area, the Village Commercial Zone. We have 170 businesses on Main Street. If you have one business owner and 2 employees as an average, you come up with 505 spaces. I don't know about you, but the only thing that's missing is customers. Can't. And the other thing I've noticed, our Main Street's made up of 3 items: the river, railroad, Rockledge. Green Street's owned in part, partially by the water and sewer department, so you're not gonna buy their properties. The fact is, we physically need to have new parking garages, elevated areas. There's been 6 spots identified that would allow that to occur. But this needs to come, of course, from the citizens that decided that they would like to get more parking. The 300-foot element is, I would say, an arbitrary number, because if you currently park at the Green Street substation and you work at Chase Street, you exceed the 300-foot mark, just on what we've got, okay? So the 300-foot mark, if you look at a radius from our Main Street to wherever, in between Warren Street and Merrill, we don't have a whole lot of real estate to work with. So irregardless of the 300-foot mark or no 300-foot mark, we are still 2 years out here short of physical parking spaces that we can put our employees and/or long-term customers. Some of the things that I identified in the inventory is there are 2 businesses that get all of their customers at the same time. Churches usually do it on a Sunday, and the Motion Picture Theater House, it usually does. You get the whole crowd. Okay, the rest come and go, and we've got the 2-hour meters to accommodate those people coming into the businesses for 1 or 2 hours or whatever. It's, you know, irregardless of any distance criteria, you physically need to actually acknowledge, accept, and appreciate that we need to generate new spaces in the downtown area. And the other thing that makes it difficult, if you're trying to do engineering for parking, the only zone that's not connected to the downtown area is the commercial industrial zone. All the other zones, 6 zones, are connected to the downtown. Okay? So where you go from one area, one side of the street, to another zone, has different rules for parking design, like setbacks, which makes it very difficult to try to increase the parking spaces in the downtown area. So this 300-foot mark, I think, is an arbitrary number. It wouldn't matter, because if you're going to do 500 feet, you would have to work towards the, the National Guard building or down by Parker Street. So that's not gonna happen. I mean, that's, our Main Street is not that large. And the remaining acreage that we have that we might be able to modify is not that large either. So I think the statement of fair and reasonable, safe, is a reasonable statement to go to, but the community needs to acknowledge, accept, and come together. It's a we, us, and ours. Nobody can do it themselves. The town, the state, the federal government, the post office has the property to generate their parking spaces, and they have to do it together as a parking garage. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Of course, as far as the creation of new parking goes, that's not really within the authority of the planning board, although many of us do recognize the need for parking. Yes.
Mark Halloran, on Carmel Drive. I'm just concerned about the language of leaving it just reasonable and safely in here. I think it's open to interpretation for everyone in this room to say what's reasonable and what's safe. And I, perhaps, and I don't, the number doesn't bother me. 300, 500, it's like Frank said, because we have all kinds of overlapping issues. But I think that perhaps work with town council to come up with better language. I just think this is wide open for all kinds of interpretations. Puts the zoning board, I think, in a very tough position. One person's safety is another person's hazard. I spoke with Joseph about this, and there's a different look on Tenny Mountain Highway if somebody wanted to do something out there, or 3A South versus doing something on one of the side streets. So I just concerned about reasonable and safe, because we're gonna have attorneys in here arguing what is reasonable and safe, and it puts the zoning board, I think, in a pretty tough position to hang their hat on something. So all I would ask is to take a look at this language and see if you can tighten it up to give a little bit more guidance to the zoning board or some clarity. Thank you.
Can I just make a note here that off-site parking facility is not allowed in the single-family residential.
Okay.
So this won't pertain at all to the single-family residential.
Interesting. Thank you. My examples were poor ones.
Took me a while to find that.
Thank you. But they could be in
My name's John Randlett, Plymouth resident, and my question was, having been on the planning board and the select board for a number of years, and we've had these parking situations come up and be discussed, and I've never seen anything come to the point of, recommending any changes to the existing articles. And I'm just wondering, because I was also informed when I was noticing this agenda and everything, that this was, brought up, I guess, at the last meeting, and that was the first time this had been brought up, and then they were gonna bring it to a public hearing this soon. And I was just wondering the reason. I mean, before we've taken 6, 7, 8 months to look at some stuff, and then propose it and have the hearings and put it up for ballot. But this seems to be a little rushed, and I'm just wondering why we feel, at the last minute we want to try to get this in, if that is the case, or what we hope to accomplish by it. How is it going to better the parking situation for Plymouth and for businesses and for customers?
I mean, I would just say, I mean, speaking for myself, I didn't feel rushed. It was kind of last minute, and it seemed to me like a reasonable change to give, to put someone's judgment in place of what seemed in some ways like an arbitrary number. And it made sense, and I knew we still had time to go to public hearing and get feedback, and obviously there is some feedback on various sides of this. And we do still have the opportunity, if after our next meeting as well, it comes to that we could pull it and say, you know, maybe it is rushed or it's not the right moment. But as a board, we looked at it and said, you know, it seems to make sense. Most of us did, and we decided to go forward. Not feeling, I think, any kind of external pressure to do so. It wasn't on the long-term agenda, but it made sense to many of us at the time.
I mean, it was brought to the board how or by who, or was there anybody that?
Planning staff raised it. Planning staff suggested the change simply as a something they noticed that was kind of rough to deal with for applicants, and you know, they had simply suggested that it would make the application process easier.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Any further comments on this amendment?
I would note that, yes, this was brought up very recently, but at the same time, how many people in the audience knew that we were discussing changing how we measured building height on Main Street before tonight? I would guess that nobody did. Maybe, but you know, in reality, the first time the public really needs to know about this is in advance of these hearings, and these hearings are your opportunity to provide comment to us. And then it's our goal to take that comment and either decide, is this something that we want to put to voters? Is it something we need to wordsmith more? Or is it something that we are going to say, we haven't thought about this enough and we're not going to put it to the voters? So, you know, this is really, until March 14th, nobody's going to vote on this anyway. So we're hoping to get feedback from all of you tonight to say, is this something that the voters would support? Is it something that's a bad idea? So we appreciate your feedback tonight. Thank you.
May I add something
You
to
may.
that as well? That if folks want to get more involved before this night, we do this the first and third Thursday of every month.
I'm sure Mr. Rowan knows.
And the you know, the agenda's posted online and in the town hall, and folks can certainly get more involved. But we talk about this stuff a lot. Some amendments need an extensive amount of discussion, and some of them are purely administrative in nature.
Can I say one?
Yes.
I appreciate you taking public comment, and Phil, you're absolutely right. This is what these sessions are for. Also, I want you to know, all of you on the planning board, how important your recommendation is. Lots of people, 300-400 people typically vote at a March meeting. And most of us look at your recommendation and take it very, very seriously, and usually vote the way you recommend. And so don't underestimate how important your recommendation is to the voters of the town of Plymouth. So, and thank you for serving on this board. I know it's not easy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
And in the past, when we've seen things that looked, you know, questionable, we have pulled things in the past. If it seemed like there wasn't broad support.
We do have 2 more articles.
Speaking of administrative changes,
John, before we
Yeah.
move on to the next article, can I
That's fine.
you may.
kind of add something to what Phil said? And I would agree that the hearing is a time to gain some input from the public. But when we spoke, the housing opportunity grant that I and Sue and yourself serve on, when we interviewed Barrett to select them, during the interview process, they said the time to get public engagement for potential zoning changes is not at the hearing. It is prior to it. And a good example is we've already written the terminology, and we've gotten some already excellent feedback, you know, about having lawyers here debating what reasonable and safely is, that type of thing. So the Barrett Engineering, Jane, I believe her name was, said,
Judy Barrett.
Judy, the absolute worst time to get your public engagement at a hearing is to do it in January or July and August when everybody's on vacation, and that's what we're doing right now. And I'm not sure if we're really, I think, and I've said this when it came to the agricultural zone, we need to have the stakeholders here working with us for the terminology, because 7 of us, yeah, we represent the town, but we don't know everything. And some of us are very new to this town. And it's nice to get the input in the engagement prior to the hearing process. And that's, I think, extremely important, and that's what Judy had mentioned, so.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I fully agree with that, and at the same time, I recognize the general lack of resources and people on the ground to really make that happen the way a lot of us would love to see. We're paying Barrett Planning, assuming the deal comes together in the end, a good amount of money to help facilitate that process. And it takes a lot of money and effort to make that happen, that as volunteers, it's difficult for us to actually do. We all do that individually and try to. And to some extent, though, I would love to see that level of engagement. And I also know with the amount of resources we have, it's difficult to do the legwork necessary to facilitate that without just you know, having people show up because they want to be part of this. And I would love to have more people involved. And this is part of why we have the master planning process, where the effort does go in to get more involvement. But again, that's only once a decade. So I agree wholeheartedly, and at the same time, I would love to know how to do that with our resources.
Well, if I can answer that, Richard Gowan and myself were on an economic development committee. We identified some things that the town really needs to look at. One was Town West Road. We talked with the owners of the property that would be part of it. They actually said, yes, they will incorporate that into any plans coming forward. Another thing that we identified was Green Street. I was working on that. Prior to COVID, we had plenty of people getting together to talk about that prior to COVID. The other thing we identified, which was the biggest thing, was parking. And we had probably 10 or 15 people at the first meeting, all volunteers, myself, semi-volunteer with the select board, and volunteering for that committee. The next meeting, I think we had 25. In 2 or 3 other meetings, we had 25 at each of those meetings. It is possible to do. You just have to invite the stakeholders there. Otherwise, they're never going to know, because I'm not sure how many people are watching the Community Access Channel each Thursday that we have our meeting. It's just not happening. And until someone lets them know, and it affects them, and it's not January during vacation month, and it's not July and August, you will get the volunteers, you will get people to show up and give their input. It happens.
I mean, I just will say, like, in terms of some of these broader changes, to like changing out the zoning for a zone, where the impact is for a pretty broad group of people, it is difficult to do that outreach. And I agree we should all try, but again, I do think there are limitations there. And I appreciate what you do to try to make that happen, and how any input you can give us going forward to get us to have more outreach, that would be fantastic. About how many people watch, I'm surprised sometimes. Like, people walk up to me and say, "Hey, I saw you on TV." I'm like, more people watch than you might think.
Who watches those?
If I may for a second.
Please, you may.
Hello, my name's Jonathan Picard. I work here at Penny Baker TV. I'm here doing the TV tonight. I make a show each week called This Week in Plymouth. It recaps all the events on the town, where we cover all the meetings. I try my best to just keep folks in the town updated for those who cannot attend the meetings or have the time to watch the meetings. So that's one other resource. It's every Saturday at 10, and it's always on YouTube every Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will look for it.
And I've watched a bunch of those. They're interesting. Well, for some of us, at least.
Yes.
John, it's your plan. We're gonna, as a board, talk about these more on the 19th.
That's the plan, yeah. I mean, if there's anything like burning we need to talk about tonight, but I don't want to make any decisions probably until like we've had full public feedback.
Now, if we were to make any changes to, can we make changes to what we present at,
On the 19th.
well, it doesn't make sense for us to make changes.
Any changes we make, I guess, should be publicly heard again, which would be at the 19th meeting.
So, but I seem to remember us saying something about if we do any changes, I mean, we're in between now and then.
I guess it's a question of also if there's substantive, like, if there are minor changes of wording to clarify versus substantive changes is also an issue.
It's also, if folks are coming to tonight but can't come next time, it means that they don't get to comment on any changes that are happening, substantial changes that are happening in between. So
Probably if there's anything really substantive, it might just mean we table it for now.
Although I do think, if we were to, at the conclusion of tonight's meeting, say that we wanted to change the minimum setback to 15 feet, we could do that, and there would still be time to have 2 hearings on the 19th and February 2nd, even though it's recommended that it be done.
It's not a hard and fast
We
rule.
could have 2 more hearings.
It doesn't leave much
but
time for staff to get all
I'm
the
not like-
wording down. But yeah,
I think we should, well, I don't know.
ideally we would.
At the close of the public hearing, we can discuss them.
Yeah. So we do still have 2 more amendments. Speaking of things that are more.
administrative.
Yeah. So Article 12, this is number 6, Article 12, Section 1204.3.g, special exception criteria, accessory dwelling unit, or accessory family dwelling, I should say. Deleting requirements for accessory family dwellings which were previously replaced by accessory dwelling units. So we have new language, accessory dwelling units, and somehow in that transition, we
Never
did
deleted.
not delete some of the language about accessory family dwellings, which are now replaced by accessory dwelling units. So this is kind of an administrative change, just to kind of clarify the language to make sure we're like on the same page throughout the entire ordinance with the up-to-date language.
There was a statewide law that prohibited us from only offering accessory family units.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of
Yes.
remove that.
And that change was made, and now, but when the change was made, it wasn't fully like complete throughout the entire zoning ordinance. Are there any comments about that change, that amendment? Okay. And then finally, our 6th amendment, Article 12, Section 1204.4, variance criteria, amending the criteria for a variance to comply with state laws. So this is another one of the instances in which, kind of from the outside, we have guidance, in this case, state laws that we need to comply with, that necessitate we update some of our variance criteria to meet those state laws to be in compliance with the law. And so is there any comment about that? The specific language is on page
67.
Starting on page 67 and going through 68, I believe.
Yeah.
The new language is primarily in 67, the stricken language is 67 and 68.
Yes.
This really isn't that imperative. I mean, the last 2 variances are state RSA. You really don't have much choice in making the changes, so thank you. I just wanted to say before I left tonight, people are always complaining about how tight restrictions are, and I appreciate a board that looks at loosening things up that can be loosened up without hurting the environment of the town. So I appreciate you guys doing this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
If there are any more comments kind of general or roll back to any of the previous discussions before we close the public hearing? No? All right, so it is 7:44, and I will close the public hearing. Again, we'll have another public hearing on the 19th.
Can I
Are there any thoughts
follow
from
up
the
on
board before we?
Mark's question? Mark, are you inclined to change any language in any of the proposed amendments? If so, tonight's the last night we should really consider that, because we do have time to get 2 more hearings in if we need to.
Well, it does raise the
Anything you're uncomfortable with?
It does raise the question about people coming tonight and.
Yes,
next time.
we would have to, I mean, we would have to renotice
Renotice
the
and all
meeting
that kind of, yeah.
the changes.
No, I mean, to me, it seemed like most of the 7 things that we discussed tonight, the vast majority of the public agreed with. There was, a lot of them had no comments whatsoever.
Yeah.
There was one, obviously, that sparked more conversation amongst people. When I had, commented earlier tonight about, I know we were having this HOP grant and what they could, or what we could potentially ask them to look at. I wasn't here in December, so I missed the 2 hearings where we discussed the 300 feet issue. And, coming in, my thought was, well, geez, if there is some public debate amongst the board, wouldn't that be a potential issue for them to look at? Parking obviously seems to be a big issue in town in general. Mr. Miller comes here almost every Tuesdays and Thursday and thankfully reminds us about the parking issues that we do have. And thank you for all the work you do with that, but it's obviously a big issue. 300 feet does kind of sound like a made-up number, right? But I believe the gentleman's name was Mark, that brought up, well, getting rid of the 300 feet might be fine, but just making it what is reasonable and safe, to him, sound like maybe a little too loose. So I wonder if someone from the outside, potentially Barrett, could say, well, 300 isn't the right answer. Reasonable and safe isn't the right answer. Here's
307.
Yeah, well, what is the recommendation from those people, right? And where should we go? So, if I was thinking about tonight, I would say that it seems like the issue where maybe we should discuss it more as a group. And I will say, and again, it's no one's fault but my own that I wasn't here in December. That's my own choice. But it was the one that came up at the end. And honestly, thanks to Mr. Rand, I was thinking this could have a big impact downtown, right? And his kind of saying, like, actually, when you look through this, it may not have as big of an impact. So even for myself, was caught not fully understanding the impact that this could have. So it seems like that's the one thing that maybe we need to spend a little more time on, or look at adjusting or defining what is reasonable and safe a little.
I have 2 follow-up questions for you. Not for you, actually, about your comments. First of all, Joseph, I know we usually get the town's attorney to look at these before they go out. Has the attorney looked at the language of these amendments at this
He has
point?
not looked at them at this time.
No, not yet. Okay.
No, not yet. That's correct.
Okay. I was just kind of curious what kind of feedback there was there, if any, yet. And when would that be happening, probably? Do you know?
Certainly, the town's attorney would look at anything before it goes to a ballot measure. So certainly, I can let you know, we're working with Scott to make sure that everything being proposed for town meeting gets reviewed by the town's attorney in a timely fashion.
Okay.
So I will certainly make sure I get an answer for that for you guys.
I can't make up the timeline, but if it was even possible to get it before next meeting or something, that would be fantastic. But I'm not sure if that's feasible. I'm just curious if you had. My next question was, as a member of the zoning board, if you have any thoughts about the language.
I think I have comments as a resident, as a zoning board member, and then as a professional engineer. I can easily define safe accessibility. I can tie that to any number of regulations. That, I think, is usual and customary standard language. Attorney will likely not have issue with that. The term reasonably is a field day. Absolute bottomless abyss. And it will likely divide the zoning board. There will be members who do not how to define that. And there would be a myriad of either engineers, civil engineers such as myself, or land use attorneys that would have a field day and could prove to no end. It's kind of like, you know, grandma's secret cookie recipe. Every grandmother has one. Every cookie is awesome. Every attorney will have that same recipe to define what reasonable is, and would make it, I think, very difficult. So, back as the resident, I think that word reasonably should be rethought and revised.
Do you have any thoughts what that might be?
Should we just strike it? Just say safely accessible?
Well, safe could be a 25-minute walk on a sidewalk.
So,
I mean, that's safe, but is that reasonable?
yeah, I mean, hey,
Does having the word
My
reasonable
opinion-
make it any different?
yeah, my opinion is just one, but I mean, for example, you have the Plymouth All-Well Center, right, with all those parking in the back? If you want to park over there, but then walk out back to a football game, that's well over 300 feet.
Yeah.
But it's hard, durable surface. It's got a lighted, blinking, safe crosswalk. The route is lit. You know what I mean? So that is a very definition of a safe, accessible route.
But it's Holderness, we don't care.
Yeah, well,
Well,
sorry, wrong town. But
not to mention public state
Yeah,
property.
they don't have to follow.
then you go down to Tenny Mountain Highway, which we sort of talked about, right? That's getting busier and busier every day, and now there's some, you know, I consider very nice, responsible development across the road there. But should someone across the street, that's 60, 70 feet, you're taking your life in your own hands. There's no way. That is not safe or accessible.
Or
Could it be, or reasonable, right? But
Even walking on the same side of the road, it's barely safe.
that's correct. That's correct. So it's a challenge. You know, as Mr. Gowan testified, and by the way, he was involved with this week's earlier program, special exception and variance. I applaud him. I mean, all the developers, and even landowners, and maybe even business owners, would like a more or less stringent regulation, which this would certainly provide. But I think it, again, my personal opinion, I think it may be a little too much, and would be difficult really for all. And I'm not advocating a number, a fixed number per se. Again, safe, accessible, I mean, ADA defines it, building code defines it, most land use regulations define it. So that's, ASHTO defines it. That's, you know, good.
So-
Can I propose a question to you? I agree with you. I think, so remember the other night, the specific case, there were a couple walking routes that were proposed that didn't cross private property. I would say neither of those were safe nor reasonable. But let's say the ZBA had denied the application because the route proposed, or the accessible route was not.
I don't know which
Accessible.
property area.
So there was a circuitous walking route to get from, there was a residence and an off-site parking
So
facility.
what street are we talking?
Main Street, Gould Terrace.
Yeah.
So
So he's on Main Street.
Yep.
And he wanted to propose off-site parking for,
On Gould,
Main
on Gould
Street on
Terrace.
Gould Terrace.
put it onto Gould
Someone's gonna
Terrace. So
have to
he's
shovel
on
those
Main Street in
stairs.
the Village Commercial.
Well, that was the
Correct.
point. The ZBA wasn't willing to consider using those stairs because it's private property. So they were proposing a route that went on public streets to get from one facility to each other, which in my mind, so
And just to be
let's
clear,
get beyond
we're not
that.
going to relitigate that
I'm
case.
not,
No, no,
I'm trying to make an example,
Yeah, yeah.
and I want to propose a question. If the ZBA had denied that and said, this is not a safe and reasonable, let's say this was in place, that case came to you again, this is not a safe and reasonable route. If they appealed that, it would go to the State Land Use Appeal Board. Do you really think that they would look at that and say, no, this is a safe and reasonable route?
I do not think so.
So, I mean, in that case, your
For a number
decision
of
would be
reasons.
upheld.
Yeah.
Can I
Right?
just point
mean,
out, it says,
and even though reasonable is a questionable word, I think it would be upheld in most cases if it's applied correctly.
Rebecca?
And there's always a safety valve to the ZBA decision at the state land use board.
if I
So
could get
why
a
is this
word
an
in
issue?
edgewise,
Wait, Rebecca.
please.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to point out two things. First is, it's reasonably, it says reasonably accessible. So it's reasonably and safely accessible. It's not a reasonable route, it's a reasonably accessible route. So I
Yes,
just want to make sure that language is clear.
Accessible. Right, thank you.
I would also like to say that I see this as an incremental improvement on what's there. I think 300 feet is arbitrary.
I agree.
And it could lead to something that is actually not safe, whereas I feel like this is an incremental change that could make things more safe and a little bit better and leaves us maybe some room for improvement, but I think that this is a small step towards making this, at least putting it to the zoning board to determine reasonably accessible and safely accessible.
And as long as we don't put ourselves in a bind legally by using certain language, which I guess is some of the concern, then we should be, then I would agree with you. And I think I do agree with you.
I don't object to that language, just given the broad nature of conditions that you can encounter in a walk. I think reasonably accessible is a good enough word.
So Mike, while Phil was pointing out that specific example, you know, there are many instances with that elevational relationship between, you know, Russell, Gould, and Main Street, where where probably several business owners that own multiple properties would have that challenge of a reasonable and safe, accessible route. And that could be defined by not only distance, but grade as well as surface conditions.
Well, the main reason why I'm questioning what property it was and the fact that they were doing off-site parking somewhere else, when we had Steve Rand come in and say, buildings on the Village Commercial, which that building is in the Village Commercial on South Main Street, does not require any parking.
Right.
And we agree, and some of us seem to have agreed with that. So why did Eric have to go to the ZBA to get off-site parking for his units in his building?
He wanted to.
No, he did, because an off-site parking as a use is only permitted by special exception in our zoning ordinance.
Well, the thing is, he didn't have parking for that building. He wanted to provide, he wanted to give an easement on other property he owned so that that parcel he wanted to sell
Yeah.
would have
Dedicated parking.
deeded parking somewhere.
Yeah.
So
But it's not preventing him from having those apartments there or
No.
anything,
No,
as I understand.
No,
no, it's not.
He just wanted to make it deeded, okay. So I stand corrected from anything I've written, that I was under the assumption that an apartment would require 2 parking spaces everywhere except for the Village Commercial. Is that?
That's correct. No required parking for any use in the Village Commercial.
And just to make a point, the houses that he owns that he wanted to provide deeded parking at are also in the Village Commercial, so it would not have been in the single family.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Right.
Which having the parking just makes it a little bit easier for the planning board to approve, as I understand it then.
I think it's good we're talking about this, just to understand the situation in that this came up in. We shouldn't be relitigating this
Oh,
decision.
no.
But
I'm not talking about
Right,
that as
yeah.
much as I just want to understand
Yeah.
what our zoning says. And, you know, I appreciate you being on both boards. I appreciate what
I
what
really
you've
appreciate
added to the
perspective you
discussion
bring
here.
forward, too.
And I appreciate everybody's discussion, but I just want to make sure I understand fully what an apartment on the Village Commercial, parking will never be brought up or could be brought up as an issue for getting an approval for a site plan.
We can't ask, our zoning ordinance does not require parking for any use within the Village Commercial District. So,
But someone could propose off-site
of
parking.
off-site parking in the
To be
village, yeah.
associated with a residence or a business in that,
Yeah.
so.
I do think this deserves a lot more discussion, and I think it needs some legal piece, because there are a lot of openness. There's just a lot there. There's a lot of scenarios, and at the end of the day, if it does end up going to a land use board, I think we should know where they would end up. I think we need to.
Any decision we make could go to that land use appeal board. Any decision we make or any decision the ZBA makes could go to the state land use appeal board and they could overturn anything we do.
And that's what I'm saying.
But that doesn't mean we should rule to their.
Certain choices are more likely than others.
I'm not saying that. I just think we need, I think we need to clarify a lot of things in this. I think there's some big holes here. And I think if you really come up with different scenarios, which there are multiple ones, you've got Tenny Mountain, you've got this, I just think it's too open.
Peter?
And I would agree with Mark that we've got the housing grant. In the process of going, they're gonna help us with wording, they're gonna look for the holes that you've talked about. We're trying desperately to try and put this through very quickly with very small amount of discussion. And we can already tell it's not ready for this. And I think Judy Barrett could have be a huge help for us.
If the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
What I was gonna say, I was gonna ask if we could sort of change the subject.
Yeah.
Still on board discussion, but back up to the height.
Okay, we'll come back to that then.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
Go ahead. Phil, did you have something you wanted to finish up?
My only point is that if the process of going through the HOP grant somehow says that we recommend that your single-family residential setbacks be changed to 10 feet, I don't think that would prevent us from voting on Article 3. I think we should consider that when we have that information, and maybe we change it again, even if we change it this year. I don't think that we shouldn't put not vote on this, making this minor change to parking on the off chance that somebody might recommend that we change it next year as well.
We don't have to put everything on hold until
No,
it's
I think
done.
we can move forward with this, and if somebody tells us this is the wrong decision, we
changes.
can look at changing it again. I really don't think this is an issue to put on the back burner.
Height issues.
Yes, thank you. I only wanted to offer this opinion with board discussions because I think I'm traveling most of the rest of the month, won't be attending. Steve Rand said, why not think higher? I hope in the HOP grant study, height is one of those discussions and made recommendations. Because, you know, if you look, you know, kind of in the, what would that be, the northern part of town, and even some of the college buildings, you know, they're much higher.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not advocating that every building on Main Street adds a second or third story, because then we'll be our little mini, you know, Michigan Ave, and you can't see anything. But I think 35 is quite low, just personal opinion. Secondly, Frank made a great comment about, you know, the town's property. I don't know the name of that street, way down by the river
Green
there.
Street.
Yeah, Green Street.
What if the town sold the property? What if we got a new facility somewhere? That property is probably how old? I mean,
That's where Plymouth Village Water and Sewer.
We don't own
the
it.
very end.
Yeah, that's
We don't
water
own
and
it.
sewer. That's the water
None of
sewer.
it?
That's the water and sewer treatment
All
plant.
of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the town could lease the part that's not developed with I mean, that's one of the things I was thinking about during that discussion is why doesn't the town just lease it from Plymouth Village Water and Sewer until Plymouth Village Water and Sewer wants to develop it,
Well,
and
that's
then you take the lease. I mean, it's a separate issue.
There's many different owners. It's a maze of owners all around Green Street. It's not just one or two. And there's a lot of, there's been conflict over the years about what should be done, and that's what we were in the process of trying to see what we could do with Green Street. And we had an engineer willing to work with the town for free to keep working on it, and then all of a sudden COVID happened.
And that's, again, not something we can really deal with here.
No,
I did want to mention that, I mean, the height issue, there are certainly buildings that are over 35 right now. Most prominently, the D&M building, which is like a classic part of our downtown.
Yeah.
We wouldn't want to see like 30 D&Ms up and down Main Street for sure.
We want to get our off-site parking squared away before we start to go up.
But I mean, at this point, I think, at least part of my thought was at least, we have 35. And if we could at least let people build to that on Main Street, we're incrementally moving in a positive, less restrictive direction that's actually in keeping with one of the most vibrant parts of our town. And if we decide after the HOP grant or after other discussions we want to go more than that, that's a discussion probably for another day, but at least I think this is an incremental change that at least puts us closer to being in compliance with what half of our downtown already is.
So John,
Yeah,
I want to think outside the box for a minute.
yeah,
There's very few opportunities for $130,000 to drop into the purse of the town to do this HOP grant. It's not gonna happen very often. And I would almost think that the chickens, floodplain development, and the variance criteria, which might be the best things to put on the town warrant for this year, and maybe table the others, and let Barrett help us, guide us through there, because she may see complete reasons, and why do it, why rush it now? And I agree, some of them, we've been talking for months, but Barrett is gonna get the engagement from the town. It's all gonna be happening in the next year, 16, 18 months at the most, and that's my recommendation.
okay.
Can I go back to the height thing?
Rebecca?
When we talk about height, I think it's a good thing to talk about. I think we're talking a lot about character though, and which is a very undefined thing when we talk about going up above the 35-foot mark. And, you know, D&M is now a college-owned building, so it's almost like, you know, it wasn't before, but it is now. You know, the college does what does,
Yeah.
you know, they could build a Empire State Building in Plymouth if they wanted to.
Be interesting.
As long as they put that off-site parking in Holderness.
My understanding is a lot of towns have a 35-foot height restriction. It has to do with kind of the height of available ladder trucks.
I feel like that's a myth. That's a,
That was
yeah,
Sure,
it's no
but
longer
it's not,
true.
I mean, the fact that the college paid for a giant ladder truck for a fire station means that we should be able to have a taller building anywhere now, right?
Well, that and fire protection has come leaps and bounds.
Yeah.
So
Well,
those
this-
height restrictions are not as life safety related.
Yeah, right.
At this point, the 35 is more about character, I think, and.
I agree.
But also changing some of this in the downtown also just brings a good chunk of our downtown into actual conformity with our zoning ordinance, which it's not right now. Like, our most vibrant part of downtown is really not in conformity with our zoning ordinance. And this brings us a little bit closer to that. And if anything like came down in downtown, which has happened historically, hopefully it won't happen anymore, and you wanted to rebuild, like, you're gonna start needing variances and stuff to rebuild, potentially. And, like, is that what you want?
I think there needs to be a lot, go ahead.
I have no problem putting forward all of these to the town warrant. I think that I feel like and I am not sitting in on the HOP grant conversations, but I think a lot of these things, I can't imagine going through, doing an audit of our zoning ordinance with a lens towards housing is really gonna change any of the things that we're putting forth here. I think what we're doing is loosening our zoning ordinance in a way that is really logical, instead of having these arbitrary, you know, a setback that we're making the setbacks less. We're not, in places where it makes sense. We're not tightening our zoning ordinance. We're doing things to make the existing neighborhoods, not make them in compliance, but any replacement that happens in these neighborhoods to be able to do those, so they fit within the character of the neighborhoods or the downtown area.
We also have to think about what the fire chief and his staff what's their reasoning behind and what's their thinking, which I don't know if we've gotten their feedback yet, and we're already in the hearing phase. It seems like we should have been talking to them prior, and we've got some old buildings in town on the main street, and what kind of construction, are we talking about reconstructing the entire downstairs to make it safe to access another floor that's maybe not there now? There's a lot of questions that we just haven't even looked at, and we're at the end of the first hearing.
That's not necessarily, I mean, how someone who owns an existing building, if they wanted to add another floor, would re-engineer that and go through the permitting process is not really the planning board's problem. If they think they can do that safely and get their permitting, that's their issue. Our issue is what kind of parameters we want to set for heights, setbacks, and those sorts of issues that would make sense for our town and to build on what's best right now in our town.
But the fire chief may have a lot more input than the seven of us. And we haven't, we're at the,
I would say that his input is rarely as valuable as the input we have when it comes to talking about zoning.
35 feet is not really a fire limit.
It's a
anymore.
zoning
It used
issue.
to
It's
be.
really not a building safety issue. If there are building safety issues, let him have all the input he wants. I really don't think changing zoning is gonna have that much of an input on that.
100 years ago, when the Pemmy House burned down downtown, ladder trucks were an issue. Right now, it's not really.
Back when they still had Dalmatians on the fire trucks. Sorry.
They often still have those around.
Okay, okay.
It's still a big
Yeah,
thing. those
okay.
fires.
Okay, is there any other?
Just real quick.
Go ahead.
One last thing on the height, because I hadn't even thought about this, but the more we've talked this evening. So in theory, Steve Rand, we'll use him as an example since he spoke, could add a additional floor. I don't know if his building you would allow that.
He could.
With up to 6 rental units. In theory.
Total.
Total, right, not knowing what he already has in the building. But you could add more, which in a way could exacerbate our issue, because they're not gonna be required parking, that you're gonna have more people parking downtown.
Really,
In
30
theory.
35 gets you two stories essentially, right?
You could squeeze
You
3 in.
usually two.
With new
probably.
construction, you could do
Yeah.
3, but,
Couple short stories.
well, no, I mean,
Short ceilings.
three 10-foot stories with a couple feet in between and a little bit of pitch for a roof.
And
Like,
actually,
that's
it's
pretty-
Habitable space too.
Yeah,
It doesn't-
it's
I mean,
doesn't
35 feet
a
is
require-
lot
habitable
of
space,
new,
yeah.
new construction, there's an allowance in the code for wood frame buildings up to 3 stories with first floor commercial and second floor residential, and you can do one of those under 35 feet of elevation.
So, I mean, the way
I
that,
don't think that's a big issue. I was just curious about that, and I wondered, Joseph, do you actually have the heights of the buildings on Main Street?
Our town data does not have height in feet, just stories. So I actually don't have that without being able to go measure or.
sounds like a good intern job.
so, so when
Mike,
we were
yeah.
discussing the height, we talked about the zoning now, does the average around the building.
Yes.
And we want to switch it to just the Main Street. So the folks on the north end could have 35 feet along the road and then have a much higher distance on the back.
downside.
So they could have 4 or 5 stories maybe, depending on how steep
On the east side.
on the bank, on
Which
the embankment.
which currently exists.
Right.
Whereas on the other side, if they're not doing the average and they're just doing on the road, they might, on the hill, could have a quarter of a story towards the back of the building. Whereas at the average,
Yeah.
they could have a much bigger building.
Right.
So we're taking away from one side of the road and giving to the other.
I mean,
That is my one issue with the. that.
we did talk about this a
Yeah.
little bit. I mean, so technically, right now, you could probably build potentially like a 50-foot building on that side on the west side of Maine. And I don't know how feasible that would be in most cases, but it's technically,
Probably more than 50 with how steep that is.
It's pretty, I mean, you'd have to go pretty far back to get that height, because it is pretty flat for a little ways.
Depends on
well,
where
so
on
there's a
South
town,
Main
there's a
Street.
town-owned land where the hotel was, the inn, which is actually steep pretty quick.
And if we try to sell that, and they have to go live within the new regulations of not the average, but Main Street, they're limited to a pretty small building rather than the average the way that it is. And I don't know whether anybody on that side of the street realizes the proposed changes that we're doing, because we didn't get the input and engagement from the citizens.
So interestingly, there's very few, I mean, and we could restrict things going forward, of course. Currently, there's very few tall buildings on that side.
And all of the buildings that are there currently are flat all the way to the back of the building.
But it's a taking if they can do it now, and then they won't be able to.
But, I mean, no, there's no taking, because it wouldn't, if they're, I mean, they can continue to use any building that's there, and any potential future development has to comply with whatever zoning is in place at the time.
Right, so right now, they
So
could,
you're hypothesizing that somebody who might buy a property might not be able to build as quite of a tall building in the future if they choose to. That's far from a taking.
That's the definition of taking. When you own land
It's
and
not.
you have uses that you can do, and then you take away those uses, that is the definition of taking, Phil.
Some of that is inherent in zoning, and it's not.
That is a taking, though.
And it's not, that doesn't mean it's illegal, it doesn't mean. we
No, it's
can't
not
do it.
illegal, it's a taking, though, whether it's illegal or not.
It doesn't seem, I understand that point, and it doesn't seem practically like it's gonna be a significant issue. This is another issue to run perhaps past the lawyer, Joseph.
Mhm.
Any other comments?
I would say the ultimate arbiters of this should be the townspeople.
And it should go through our lawyer first.
Sure, absolutely.
You know, not that we're a Concord, but obviously we're all well aware of how Main Street has been redeveloped
Yeah,
throughout the last 10 years,
Yeah.
including, say, the Concord Hotel
sure.
that has, I think, 2 or 3 stories of subterranean parking from Main Street, but at-grade parking from, I think it's Hall Street or whatever. And I wonder how their height is measured. Maybe their height is measured from habitable space, you know what I mean, from there up, where parking is not it doesn't diminish your height measurement.
Wonder. There's already a precedence of much taller buildings there too, but yeah, I mean, they have the same condition we would have with
Similar,
Main and Green
quite
Street.
similar, I would think.
Yeah, it is.
But like you mentioned, the town-owned property over here, should that be developed, that is ripe for,
Yeah.
you know, parking them first 2 stories and then go up.
It's my ski route for going downtown.
Yes,
We'll keep the right of way on that website.
I hope you're wearing a helmet.
You just make a couple quick turns, you're fine.
All right, any other questions, comments on zoning ordinances? Well, thanks for the good discussion.
Great discussion.
I agree. Yeah. Any other unfinished business from board members or planning staff or just other business? Okay. Are there public comments?
Now's your chance.
Yeah?
I have one. I'd like to thank you guys. I've served on the planning board and I know how it is. I know how it is with these hearings. And I appreciate you putting in your time and thank you very much.
I think you were a selectman who seated me here, so thank you.
See that table for a while.
Okay.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
Okay, we have a move to, adjourn and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the meeting is adjourned at 8:16. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.